Welcome to Parasitic Diseases, an introduction to Eukaryotic Parasites. This is our second presentation in a 45 presentation online course called Parasitic Diseases. I should mention that all of this is funded in part by a grant from the Donald and Barbara Zucker Family Foundation, and we're deeply grateful for them for allowing us to present this material to you in the format in which you will be seeing it. So we're all set to go. So let's, without further ado, introduce who are the players that appear in the pages of Parasitic Diseases that we consider genuine threats to our health. We should begin by just showing you where they fit in on the phylogenetic tree of life. And there are many versions of this out there, but as you can see, these are conveniently colorized to allow us to place into context where the bacteria, for instance, fit, and where the archaea, for instance, fit, and again, where the eukarya fit. And those are the ones that we will be discussing. These are considered higher life forms compared to the archaea or the bacteria, but in essence, it's very difficult to make a decision as to what is a higher or lower life form based on the fact that if you're a single cell, you have to do everything that a multicellular organism does, all within the same cell. So I have a problem with dealing with whether this is a higher or lower life form. I'm just going to tell you that this is another kind of life form. So we're dealing with the eukaryotes, the ones with true nuclei. And as you can see, the number of eukaryotic parasites that infects humans are a lot. When I say a lot, I mean it's over 400 different species of protozoans and helminths that have been isolated from infected human beings throughout the entire world. And that number continues to grow as we discover new entities. But we're pretty confident that it probably won't exceed, let's say, another 10 or 15 different eukaryotic parasites. I think we've done a very good job of identifying them. So let's start with a brief discussion of a parasitic protozoan. So here are a number of pictures that you can see before you. We have malaria at the upper left. I'll put the pointer on that one. And then if I move over to the next frame, we have a picture of an organism called Trypanosoma cruzi. It's an intracellular parasite. And the next one over is another intracellular parasite called Toxoplasma gondii. And these names will become familiar to you when we present each one as an individual chapter in our book, Parasitic Diseases. But here we have another one to the lower left. It's not an intracellular parasite at all, and it's a very unusual one indeed. It lives in the blood supply, and it's got a very large, prominent, what looks like a nucleus, but actually is not, as we'll get to much later. Here's the nucleus of this cell right over here. We move over to an amoeba that's found in nature as not as a parasite, but it's an opportunistic parasite when it gets into humans. And we'll see how that works also. So not all these organisms are first-class parasites. Some of them are facultative parasites. And here's one that almost looks like Pac-Man. So it's got a humorous look to it, but it's not very humorous if you acquire this, of course. So let's discuss how some of these organisms gain entry into us. And I thought we were protected by skin, and we have mucous membranes that protect us from the entry of various pathogens. But some of these organisms take advantage of those mechanisms of protection and turn them into mechanisms of infection instead. So Giardia, for instance, is acquired simply by eating something. In this case, contaminated food or water. We have a few that are sexually transmitted. We can inhale them even, without being aware of the fact that they're in the dust that we're inhaling, and we can acquire an infection such as Toxoplasma gondii. We have direct contact, where the organism must encounter a mucous membrane in order to infect. In this case, it's a protozoan infection that's found throughout South and Central America. And finally, we have arthropod vectors, of course, as we've discussed earlier. These are insects that or organisms with jointed legs that would come over bite us, deposit a larva on our skin, or inject a protozoan directly into our blood supply. Where these organisms actually live in the body is determined by two sets of biological principles. One is the human immune system, both innate and acquired, and other versions of that in between, I might add, and also the biological characteristics of the infectious agent in question. And when those two systems come together, if the organism that's invading is to succeed, they must somehow avoid those immune mechanisms which would protect the host against infection to begin with. So through evolution, organisms have been selected to avoid the very immune systems that have evolved in order to protect us against most of the infectious agents out there, but not all of them. So we call this niche selection. And the niche, of course, is definable by all of the chemical, biological, and physical parameters, which goes into describing what an organism actually needs in order to live. Very difficult to describe. This course will not cover all of those things. It will only define the things that are important for either telling why that organism caused disease, how the diagnosis was made, or why the treatment actually works. Now, throughout evolutionary history, as soon as the human species evolved some 200,000 years ago into what we are today, we have encountered so many different parasites that we can now be confident in saying virtually almost every single cell type in the human has been parasitized by a eukaryotic parasite at some point in our evolutionary history. Describing all of those niche selection characteristics, again, is a little bit difficult beyond the scope of this course. So, like I said, we'll refer to them when it's important. The most successful parasites are those that continue to avoid the immune system. That's the most important thing that a parasite can evolve towards, is the avoidance of immunity. And so one of the most successful parasites on Earth is the one which infects the most organisms, and the one which has evolved the most successful evasion strategies for avoiding our immune system, namely Toxoplasma gondii. It turns out to be the most successful infectious agent on the planet, and we'll see why when we discuss it. Protozoans reproduce by a variety of reproductive strategies. Many of them involve binary fission. If one organism, it divides in half. Now you have two organisms. Some employ sexual behavior, particularly in the case of malaria, and others employ both of those strategies. And I come back now again to the malarial parasites. They're both asexual and sexual behavior. When we discuss the survival of the parasite in the host, we obviously must discuss how it avoids the immune system. Now, some of them actually don't avoid the immune system, but rather change their antigen signature as the immune system evolves to knock off one version of it. But by the time it's finished doing that, the organism has changed to the next version, which it now has to respond to from scratch, so to speak. Others inhibit the immune response. So they don't have to worry about avoiding it, they just simply inhibit it. And others avoid the immune response simply because while the stage that induced immunity got rid of one stage, it did not get rid of the dormant stage, which can now flare up again as soon as immunity wanes. And we'll talk about that as these organisms are discussed individually. Finally, we have a group of organisms which have learned to survive in the environment. They don't actually have to avoid the immune system the entire time that they're in existence. They produce stages which are environmentally resistant, such as Giardia and Entamoeba histolytica. Again, these are names that you're not familiar with right now, perhaps, but certainly by the end of these presentations, you will be discussing them as though they're household words, I hope. We have to include in the avoidance of immunity the way an organism induces its disease in us. And so this is called mechanisms of pathogenesis. Organisms can just crush us, just kill our cells. It's a very unsophisticated way of evolving, but we know that Entamoeba histolytica, the causative agent for amoebic dysentery, simply kills off the cells, and that prevents them from interacting with the parasite. Toxoplasma gondii has a completely different strategy, again, as I'll show you, and as does Trypanosoma cruzi, for that matter. Virulence factors abound in virtually every group of protozoans that infect the human host has its own unique set of strategies, which allows it to not only survive in the host, but also produce disease. Sometimes they employ specialized enzymes that alter the biochemistry of the host in favor of allowing the survival of the parasite. Sometimes it even involves another organism living within the parasite itself, in this case, a double-stranded RNA virus. We have several examples of those to tell you about as well. Finally, there are byproducts of the parasite itself, which are immunomodulatory and that allow the parasite to live a longer life than it would if those products hadn't been produced. And there is one which I refer to in this slide called hemozoin, which is a breakdown product of normal hemoglobin, which the parasite uses as its food source. And we'll discuss that too. All these will become more definable, of course, when we move into the individual organisms. Worms, on the other hand, when you compare them to the protozoans, represent a whole different strategy for survival within the host. And in some cases, the parasites elect not to go inside the host, anatomically speaking. So they only live in the gut tract, for instance, which is considered, at least anatomically, as being still on the outside of the host. So let's see a few of those organisms and what they'll do to get into us to begin with. So many of them are transmitted by the oral route. You can see a few examples listed at the top here: Trichuris, Trichinella, Paragonymous. Some of them come in the form of foodstuffs, some of them in the form of contaminated water. Some, not many, but some, can actually penetrate the unbroken skin. Our first line of defense is defenseless when it comes to preventing hookworm infection or preventing schistosome infection, as we will see. Vector-borne, of course, it's hard to evolve a strategy which prevents you from becoming infected with something that a mosquito injects into you. And so we have a number of diseases, both viral, bacterial, rickettsial, protozoal, and helminths, which are transmitted by arthropods and which continue to plague the human condition. Niche selection, where these parasites end up living, again, is determined not only by the characteristics of the organism in question, but also the human immune system. And because of the variance in the human immune system from place to place, from groups of people to other groups of people, we have different niche selections and different groups of parasites which have elected by selection only to live in a particular place. But striated mussel, there are very few parasites that actually live there, and that's one of the dominant cell types in our body. Intestinal lumen is very common for parasites to locate to because it doesn't actually have to deal with the immune system as an organism living within the blood supply, for instance, or living within lymph or the cerebrospinal fluid might have to deal with. Of course, they occupy the blood supply. Some of them actually prefer to live in the liver. When I say prefer, that means they were selected for life there. There's no selection by the parasite per se. It's an exclusionary type of concept. Some obviously invade brain and the nervous system, eye, subcutaneous tissues, of course, the lungs, and one even lives in our ventricles in the heart. So these are all of these successful systems that we represent as a host that have attracted these parasites to those regions of the body, and because of natural selection, have resulted in this relationship, which we still have to this day. Worms reproduce in a variety of manners. Some make eggs, some give live larvae off, some have both male and female organs inside of them as a single organism. Others have sexes that are separated. Again, these are general characteristics that I'll come back to as soon as the specifics are required for discussion. And just to summarize up, the mechanisms of survival for helminths are no different than those for protozoans, although the scale might be different. Immune strategies for kicking out worms are as sophisticated and as robust as those that are used to limit our protozoan infections as well. And it depends on where those parasites live, depends on what they use as virulence factors to ward off the immune system. There's a whole bunch of scenarios that we could discuss which they have available to them, which they use in order to succeed. Pathogenesis, of course, the same. A number of secreted substances or locations in the body allows these parasites to succeed, whereas a lot of other things that tried the same stunt, so to speak, to get inside of us did not succeed because they didn't have the right set of genetics which allowed them to produce the substances which inhibited the immune system or which confounded us into thinking that even some of them look like us. We are unable to recognize the antigenic difference between us and them.
Now, in addition to the mechanisms, I'm going to be jumping in and talking about how the characteristics of the parasite impact the clinical picture. And niche selection, whether or not it's heading to muscle, so striated, skeletal, intestinal lumen, lymphatics, bloodstream, liver, gallbladder, brain, eye, subcutaneous tissue, lung, or heart. The niche selection is going to impact what sort of clinical symptomatology we're going to see. Also, the mechanism of pathogenesis is going to impact what we see in the patient. Is the organism causing cell death? Is it releasing virulence factors? Are there byproducts of parasite metabolism? Is it causing damage as it migrates? Are there mechanical impacts? Or is it triggering an immune response that we're seeing? And then the exposure history. Different ways that parasites might infect us will impact the context in which we see these different infections. So has the person been putting something in their mouth maybe that has pathogens? Has there been sexual contacts that we need to know about? Have they been breathing? If people would just stop eating and breathing. But have they potentially brought something in through the pulmonary route? Or is it direct contact? And then finally, the ubiquitous arthropod vectors. So based upon the exposure history, the mechanism of pathogenesis, and the niche selection, we're going to see various clinical presentations. So
without actually saying more in detail, there is, of course, many excellent reviews out there that summarize this in a much more rigorous fashion than what we've just undergone. I've given you a taste of the way protozoans behave, the way helminths behave. Again, we'll come back to all of these subjects as we discuss individual parasites, but here's a nice reference for you to look at, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for listening.